In the middle of the 1800s, the United States was a nation filled with hope. Railroads were stretching across new lands, bridges were connecting distant towns, and millions of people dreamed of a better life. But beneath this growing promise, something dark and powerful was rising, something that could no longer be contained. It was a conflict older than the country itself, a conflict built on the question of freedom, and the question of slavery. The North and the South were no longer just regions, they were two separate worlds. One moved toward factories, machines, and free labor. The other depended on plantations, cotton, and enslaved people forced to work under brutal conditions. Every election, every law, every new territory added to the map pushed the nation closer to breaking. Leaders argued. Newspapers fueled anger. Neighbors turned against each other. And in the middle of all this, the American people could feel the ground shaking beneath their feet. They knew something terrible was coming, something bigger than politics, bigger than fear. A storm was building, and soon it would explode into the deadliest war ever fought on American soil, the Civil War. Long before a single bullet was fired, the country had been fighting a silent war of words, beliefs, and laws. The question of slavery had divided Americans for generations. The North grew more confident that slavery had no place in a modern world, while the South saw it as the heart of their economy. Both sides believed they were fighting for their way of life. Both believed they were right. Every new state that joined the Union became a battleground. Politicians argued whether it would be free or slave. The debates in Congress became louder, angrier, and more desperate. Compromises were written, torn apart, rewritten, and destroyed again. None of them solved the problem, because the real problem was that the country was living in two different futures. Then came the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. To many Southerners, his victory was a threat, a signal that slavery would soon end forever. Fear spread across the South. One by one, states announced they were leaving the United States. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America, with their own president, their own flag, and their own army. America had become two nations. And two nations could not share one land in peace. The breaking point arrived before dawn on April 12, 1861. In the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Union soldiers stood inside Fort Sumter, surrounded by Confederate forces who demanded their surrender. The Union troops refused. The tension hung in the air like a final breath before a punch. At 4:30 a.m., the sky erupted. Confederate cannons unleashed a storm of fire, and for 34 hours, the fort was pounded by artillery shells. Smoke covered the water. Fire lit the sky. The world watched as the first shots of the Civil War echoed across the ocean. No soldiers died in the battle, but the war it unleashed would claim more than 620,000 lives. For the North, the attack was an insult that demanded action. For the South, it was the first step toward proving they could stand as an independent nation. The war had officially begun. And there was no turning back. After Fort Sumter, the United States transformed overnight. Young men rushed to enlist. Farmers left their fields. Shopkeepers closed their stores. Teachers, lawyers, students, ordinary people, found themselves holding rifles for the first time. Some joined with excitement, dreaming of glory. Others joined with fear, knowing they were walking into the unknown. But all of them believed they were fighting for something greater than themselves. The South moved quickly. They named Jefferson Davis as president of the Confederacy and began building an army from scratch. They had fewer factories and fewer men, but they had military experience, pride, and determination. The North, led by President Lincoln, faced the enormous task of bringing the rebellious states back into the Union. They had more factories, more weapons, more money, but they needed time. And time was something the Confederacy hoped to take away by striking fast and hard. Across America, families cried as sons and fathers marched off to war. Nobody knew how long it would last. Many thought it would be over in weeks. The first major battle of the Civil War erupted near a small Virginia stream called Bull Run, or Manassas. Crowds of civilians came to watch, bringing picnic baskets and blankets, expecting a quick and easy Northern victory. What they got instead was chaos. Both armies were inexperienced. Orders were confused. Smoke filled the air as thousands of frightened young soldiers fired wildly across open fields. Horses screamed. Cannons thundered. The ground shook beneath the weight of history's first steps into total war. Just when the Union Army thought they had the upper hand, a Confederate general stood firm, refusing to retreat. His men said he stood like a stone wall. His name was Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, and his bravery inspired the Southern troops to push forward with renewed fury. The Union Army broke. Soldiers fled back toward Washington, and the South claimed a shocking victory. Bull Run made one thing clear. This war would not be easy. It would not be quick. It would not be clean. It would be a long, brutal test of endurance, and both sides now understood the horrifying reality they had entered. As the war stretched into its second year, battles became larger, deadlier, and more desperate. In September 1862, the Union and Confederate armies met near a quiet creek in Maryland called Antietam. What happened there would become the bloodiest single day in American history. From sunrise to sunset, the fields of Antietam turned into a nightmare. Cornfields became killing zones where bullets cut through stalks and soldiers alike. A sunken road, later named Bloody Lane, became a grave for hundreds of men as bodies piled on bodies. Near a stone bridge, Union soldiers charged again and again, falling in waves under Confederate fire. By the time the sun set, more than 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. Families waited for letters that never came. Towns filled with hospitals where surgeons worked without rest. But Antietam brought one major turning point. The Union stopped the Confederate invasion of the North. And President Lincoln used the moment to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. The war was no longer just about saving the Union. It was now a battle for human freedom. The meaning of the war had changed forever. Before the war, slavery had been a national argument. After Antietam, it became the moral center of the conflict. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, an act that transformed the war into a fight for justice. The proclamation did not free every enslaved person immediately, but it declared that the Union would fight until slavery was gone forever. It also allowed formerly enslaved men to join the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers would eventually serve, fighting for their freedom, their families, and their future. For the Confederacy, the proclamation was a devastating blow. European nations that might have supported the South now refused to join a war defending slavery. The South found itself isolated. The North gained new soldiers, new spirit, and a clear moral purpose. Yet the war continued with brutal intensity. The Confederacy would not surrender easily. Southern armies pushed north again. Northern armies pushed south. The war became a sweeping storm across the land, leaving destruction wherever it passed. The conflict was entering its darkest, bloodiest, and most decisive chapter. While Lee fought in the east, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman led a bold and terrifying campaign in the west. His goal was simple but ruthless: break the South's ability to wage war by destroying its farms, railroads, factories, and supply lines. After capturing Atlanta in 1864, Sherman began his infamous march to the sea. His soldiers burned crops, tore up railroads, destroyed warehouses, and took supplies wherever they went. Town after town watched Union troops pass through like a rising wave of destruction. Sherman's march was not just a military operation, it was psychological warfare. It sent a message to the South. The Confederacy could no longer protect its land. The war was slipping away from them. Meanwhile, Union forces in Virginia pushed relentlessly against General Lee's dwindling army. The South was running out of men, food, and hope. Cities fell. Railroads collapsed. The Confederate government fled. The Confederacy was dying, and everybody knew it. By early 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted. Confederate soldiers had marched barefoot through snow, surviving on scraps. Cities like Richmond were burning as Union forces closed in. Robert E. Lee, once confident, now commanded an army that was starving, freezing, and surrounded. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Union General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The two men, both tired from years of war, sat in a small home to decide the fate of a nation. Grant offered generous terms: Confederate soldiers could go home, keep their horses, and would not be punished as long as they laid down their weapons. Lee agreed. After 4 years of agony, the Civil War was finally ending. When Lee left the house, Union soldiers silently removed their hats as a sign of respect. Despite the brutal war, both sides understood the magnitude of the moment. America had been broken, but now it had a chance to heal. But healing would not be easy. The country had lost entire towns, countless families, and more soldiers than any war before or after. The victory was real, but so was the pain. The American Civil War was more than a conflict between armies, it was a battle for the country's identity. It reshaped what freedom meant, redefined what the United States stood for, and determined whether the nation would remain whole or break apart forever. More than 620,000 Americans died: fathers, sons, brothers, friends. Entire families were torn apart. Cities were reduced to ash. The land itself still carries scars of the war. But out of this unimaginable suffering came a rebirth. Slavery, the institution that had divided the nation from its beginning, was abolished. Millions of formerly enslaved people stepped into a new, uncertain freedom, one that would take generations to fully secure. Lincoln did not live to see the peace he worked for. He was assassinated just days after the war ended. But his words still guide the nation's memory: a house divided cannot stand. And though the house shook, cracked, and nearly collapsed, it survived. The Civil War remains a powerful reminder of how fragile unity can be, and how hard a nation must fight to protect it. Its lessons echo across time, urging each generation to choose understanding over division, justice over oppression, and unity over hatred. Thank you for watching this interesting documentary. If you want more cinematic stories from history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, remember the past, honor the fallen, and keep searching for more.